I think those Marilyn pieces are really brilliant.
I think it makes me think about the significance of having an iconic image.
The Marilyn Monroe is a kind of hinge for everything that Andy Warhol ever did. She represents so much.
Because they got sloppy. Sometimes the lines, around the lips would get messy and it would look almost like this sort of reapplication of lipstick or makeup.
The nice thing about the Marilyn is that he also did them in lots of different versions.
The work still remains so contemporary when you look at it.
Imagine crafting your own wall art. Maybe it's a passion that fascinates you. Or maybe it's the promise of an immersive creative experience like no other. A piece of iconic art that you can build for yourself. Relax and reconnect with your creative side. We've created unique soundtracks curated around the world of art, music, and movies. And in this soundtrack, we're going into the life and work of Andy Warhol. We'll hear from 2 Warhol experts. One of them just wrote a biography about Warhol, and one of them is curator at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. We'll also speak to 2 talented younger artists and hear how they're influenced by Andy Warhol. And then we'll be joined by the Lego designers who created the Lego art pictures of the Marilyn portraits and get a peek behind the curtain of what it's like working at the Lego Group. You can listen as you build at your own pace and get the inside story. Ready to dive in? I'm Andrea Collins. Welcome to Lego Art. Our first guest is Blake Gopnik. He's an art critic from New York and just published a giant 1,000-page biography about Andy Warhol. So in his own words, he knows everything about Warhol. Blake, what can you tell us about the book?
Well, it tries to be comprehensive. It tries to literally cover Andy from cradle to grave. And it tries to be as much about the art as about the man, because the art is why we care about the man. And in this one rare case, the man is one of the works of art. He created himself as a kind of living sculpture.
What was it that made Andy Warhol so unique and different in his time?
Well, up until the time of Andy Warhol, the main mode of producing art was to say, how can I make my pictures look different from the pictures that came before? How can I have a new style? How can I even have a new way of talking about the world through style? But with Andy Warhol, all of a sudden, style just becomes so much less important. It becomes so much more about simply holding things up to be noticed, to holding up a can of Campbell's soup, almost unchanged really, and saying, look at this, think about this. It's really the first example of what we now call appropriation, taking things straight from the world, unchanged, and putting them into your art. Taking Marilyn Monroe from a kind of unimportant studio photograph and holding her up, putting her in your art and saying, look at this.
We're also joined by another art expert, Jessica Beck, who is working as a curator at the Andy Warhol Museum, located in Pittsburgh, where he grew up. Since arriving at the Warhol in 2014, she has curated many projects, and her area of focus is Andy Warhol and contemporary art. Outside of the museum, Jessica has served as a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Mellon School of Art. Jessica, what would you say was unique about Warhol?
I think, the thing about Andy Warhol and the reason why he was a truly unique artist, I think, and particularly he ended up, his legacy is an international legacy, but he really, truly tapped into an American fantasy. And I think that's part of the enduring quality of his work. His work deals with a fascination with celebrity and products and concepts that transcend class in America, which is really important to his story. Particular American fantasies around success and notoriety and celebrity, also bodily perfection. The figures in all of his work are kind of have this perfect skin or wrinkle-free faces. All of his portraits were sort of touched up, as he said, in the 70s.
Blake, would you agree on that?
There's so many different American fantasies. He certainly tapped into a bunch of them. The fantasy of consumer goods available to all. The fantasy of celebrity available to all for at least 15 minutes a person. There's so many different aspects of American life that he tapped into, and sometimes quite critically. sometimes his goal wasn't necessarily to celebrate American life, but also really to put it under a microscope and ask us, is this how life should be lived?
What were some of those instances?
Well, when you look at his most famous and first really major body of work, those Campbell soup cans, you have to ask yourself, is he saying, isn't it wonderful that everyone can have a can of soup? Or is he in fact saying, look at American society, it's reduced to offering people cans of soup rather than real food for their soul. And the great thing about Andy Warhol is you can never finish coming down on one side or another. When you take up one of those arguments, you've got to also entertain the opposite one.
A lot of the criticism of the early Campbell soup paintings, there was this sense almost that people thought Warhol was making fun of the art world, or that it was a joke in some way. I think there was some confusion. There was a sense of like, what should we make of these paintings? Yeah, the Campbell soups were seen, especially that Ferris Gallery exhibition, Warhol's first exhibition in California, in which he painted all of the varieties, the 32 varieties of Campbell soups. And they were small canvases that then sat on a wooden ledge on the wall and went around the gallery. It wasn't, I don't think it was, unanimously praised in any way. But there was some skepticism on how serious Andy Warhol was. Was he a serious painter? Is he making a big joke about the art world with these Campbell soup paintings? The Marilyn paintings also were famously said to be, Michael Fried wrote an article or a review of, I think, that Stable Gallery exhibition in which they were featured, and said something like, this work will never endure time, or this work will never outlast this moment, which is really interesting to think.
Wow. This work will never endure time. This work will never outlast this moment. Someone actually said that about the Marilyn Monroe paintings? Well, here we are, more than 50 years later, and they were chosen to be the first pieces of Lego art. I think it's so interesting how some experts can be so wrong. Warhol's art definitely endured time and is still very relevant today. Let's talk more about why that is and bring in our two next guests.
My name is Devan Shimoyama. I am a visual artist living and working in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I primarily do painting and some installation-based work, and I also teach full-time at Carnegie Mellon University.
My name is Lucia Hierro. I'm a Dominican-American conceptual artist based in New York.
Lucia and Devan are two younger artists that are influenced by Warhol's work. Like Jessica Beck, Devan is also from Pittsburgh, and he actually did his first solo show at the Andy Warhol Museum. So Jessica, can you help me introduce him?
Yeah, I met Devan in 2016, and we worked together for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, on an exhibition called Devan Shimoyama Crybaby, his first solo show. And I met him here in Pittsburgh, and we did a studio visit. And on my first studio visit with him, I was amazed at the resonance of, or the similarities between Warhol's 1974 series of the ladies and gentlemen portraits that he did and some of Devan's portraits, self-portraits that he was creating at the time. And I was just immediately struck by the sophistication in his painting practice. He's quite young and has a very clear vision, which was really surprising and fascinating and intriguing. So I immediately said I wanted to work with him and asked him, if he would come to the museum. And we walked through the collection and I showed him these ladies and gentlemen paintings.
In a YouTube video that was released by the Andy Warhol Museum at the time of Devan's show, Jessica also said that the Warhol Museum was the perfect place for Devan to have his first solo show, and that Devan's work brings Warhol's work to life.
That is extremely generous. Working with Jessica was so amazing to be able to do that. I feel like we have this really great harmony throughout the entire trajectory of the show. There was a lot of really significant moments that I felt like she had this true deep understanding of Warhol in this way in which I hadn't experienced in learning about Warhol in school. Most of the time you learn about Warhol, you think of his Marilyn portraits or those kinds of versions of his kind of like pop culture lens. But working with Jessica, I got to really see some of the weirder, darker underbelly of his practice. And I feel like some of that stuff really relates to my work. A lot of the stuff that didn't get a lot of publicity back when he was alive. And so that included the Ladies and Gentlemen series, which resonated with my practice through and through. And I thought it was really incredible to be able to see my work hanging alongside some of those works in the museum.
How does it feel to have your work, exhibited alongside Warhol's?
I never really even expected to actually have an exhibition there in any way, any work in there. When Jessica came to talk to me about doing the exhibition, proposing a show for the museum, I, even at that point, at most thought, oh, maybe I could do a project space downstairs in the lobby or something, or in the windows. But, so it was a pretty major achievement, and something that I think is really significant. Also, being an artist of color in that space is so substantial. I got to live in the town where my first museum show was, which was really fortunate. So I got to see a lot of passersby walking through the museum. I would visit frequently, and seeing more people of color in the museum identifying with the work that was presented there was really potent to me. And then seeing them think about Warhol in a new way, maybe a little differently.
Yeah. Do you think that you would have been a different artist if it wasn't for Warhol, or how much do you think he has inspired you?
I think that the art world in general would be a vastly different landscape without Warhol. I think there's certain artists that kind of make big shifts culturally or even globally in a lot of ways. Like I think about his effect as a ricochet throughout other even continents, even people receiving that work, and how, when it gets to other places, how it fits their culture at that time. So I do think that the impact that Warhol had was on a scale that was so vast. And maybe during a time also in which we were able to really digest and it's during a shift in popular culture where it starts to become slightly more global. And I think that, the art world in general maybe wouldn't be intersecting as much as it does currently with sort of like celebrity culture, fashion, other markets, music industries. I think that sort of that model that he set up with his studio, with making material out of just like culture itself, was just like, I don't know, it's just incredible. And I think that, the dealing with the multiple, people are doing printmaking in this big scale, making commodities. And, I think that the art world would just be a different place. Maybe I'd be a jewelry maker, but still an artist on the inside, but wouldn't be brave enough to say it. I don't know. What
about you, Lucia? For people who haven't seen your art, can you describe what you do?
Oof, that's a doozy always. Explaining art is sometimes like explaining a joke. At the moment, for the past few years, have been working with digital printing on fabric. And I use those prints in various forms. I make sort of collage, assemblage work with those images. And I also make some sculptural works with them as well.
What does Andy Warhol mean to you?
Andy, to me, it's a sort of BC, AC thing. It's like before Andy Warhol and after Andy Warhol. He definitely marks a shift in the art world, and I see him as being the person that made it possible for me to be doing what I do now.
Why do you think his art is still so relevant today?
I think it's more relevant than ever because there's like Uniqlo, Andy Warhol t-shirts and all that stuff. I think probably the most well-known artist to the general public that doesn't really know much about art. And I think it's precisely because of that I will count him in there as one of my favorite artists. He was just so influential, and he changed the scene so much that we don't even realize that the art market as it exists today was highly affected by his presence.
Jessica?
Yeah, definitely. I think this concept of again, self-fashioning or branding. It really has become part of art practice, contemporary practice today, to have an online presence, whether that be through a website or an Instagram account. Understanding how to market your work as an artist are kind of concepts that Warhol built into his career. But this pop sensibility, this idea of pop portraiture, for sure comes out in someone like Devan Shimoyama's practice, a younger painter that focuses on Black portraits. But I think that artists that also work with commercial products, or similarly to Warhol's Coca-Cola, early Coca-Cola paintings from 1962, that there's this sense, that anyone can drink a Coke, this famous quote that, the same Coca-Cola that Elizabeth Taylor is drinking is the same Coca-Cola that I can drink, this kind of democratic American idea around certain products. And that comes out as a sort of biography story or an identity story in Lucia Hierro's work.
That's right. Lucia, maybe you could talk a bit more about that. Looking at your work, you often use objects and icons from society. Is there a link between that sort of work and what Warhol was doing with the Campbell's soup cans and Coca-Cola that Jessica was talking about?
There's a similar parallel. I think it's almost using his work as a point of departure, or artists like him, where they were thinking about commerce, and specifically Andy thinking about fine arts and commerce, which was not something that people were consciously doing. People weren't, Rauschenberg and Johnson them weren't really doing institutional critique when they started. But I think Andy was doing institutional critique before he knew to call it that.
Is it correct to say that your art might be in some ways a modernized method of Warhol's work?
I think it's a version, for sure. Yeah, I think it's oddly, that's the thing. I tend to think that this has to be called something else, because the pop art that him and his contemporaries pioneered has evolved in such a way, thanks to social media and the digital sphere, that it definitely is something else, something sort of neo something. But I'm also looking at it from a post-colonial lens, so to speak. And I think that's a differentiation between the work. Although I feel really connected to Andy in the sense that we're both first-generation immigrants. And that has a real effect on the way that we're looking at America and its relationship to our countries of origin.
Warhol has a particular, has a very particular American sensibility of understanding the idea of commerce, the market value of art practice. And so his early years in New York as a commercial artist, an illustrator, working for magazines, and working with ad agencies, and understanding how images operate on a market system and what sells, essentially, and also understanding how to work collaboratively. I really think that those years in the 1950s in New York, when he's working with a bunch of advertising agencies and he's hearing feedback from the editors, and the kind of difference between Warhol and some of his other colleagues at that time was that he was often open to changing or making edits to his drawings. So this sense that he's working with other people and he's taking feedback from other people, he always incorporated that into his practice. When you get to the 1960s with something like screen printing, that is actually like a group, that has to be the group effort, essentially, because it's very hard to screen print on your own, especially with large screens. So I think, Warhol understood this marketability that can be sometimes inherent to art making, and he incorporated that throughout the rest of his life. He struggled with that concept of just being a commercial artist or just being seen as a commercial artist, but ultimately, it's why I think he is still so contemporary, why the work remains to feel contemporary. It's not just that Warhol's name prevails or the legacy prevails, it's that the work still remains so contemporary when you look at it.
Let's hear from Blake Gopnik on this. So why do you think Warhol is still so relevant here in the 2020s?
The thing about Andy Warhol's art is that it exists in so many different versions of itself. I mean, there's the Campbell soup cans he starts with, which are just hand-painted pictures of cans of Campbell soup. Then there are the silk screens that he does a little bit later of celebrities, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley. Then he does a novel, which is simply 24 hours of someone talking, basically unedited. He did TV shows. He did every kind of work of art you can imagine. He did sculpture. The sheer range of his work is unparalleled, and it gives license to today's artists to do more or less whatever they want to do. After all, Andy Warhol was a filmmaker. He was a painter. He was a printmaker. He was a TV producer. He was a movie producer. He starred even on The Love Boat, a terrible 1980s sitcom. He really allowed himself to do anything. And most importantly, he declared that anything he did counted as art. And ever since then, artists like Jeff Koons or Damien Hirst took that same kind of license.
He's really one of those artists that makes you feel like you as a person aren't doing enough.
Yeah, he was, among other things, famous or infamous, at least in his immediate circle, for being the world's worst or best workaholic. Yeah. He really worked nonstop. He made a quantity of images that you can't imagine. I mean, in the 1950s, he wasn't the most famous commercial illustrator by any means, but he got to be one of the very richest ones just by turning out more illustrations than anyone else could ever have imagined turning out. I mean, I've gone through his invoices, and he sent out invoices, sometimes 2 or 3 every single day of the week.
Wow. Let that be a lesson to all of us entrepreneurs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, do you see the influence of his art and his way of working in works from younger artists today? And if so, in what way?
Well, you could say that every single young artist who picks up a video camera is really following in his footsteps. And I happen to believe that video art is our greatest form of art today. I mean, Andy was the very, very first person to use a video camera to make art with. And that's kind of amazing. In fact, he was about as early as you could be because portable video cameras had barely been invented when he started. And in fact, his love of technology is something that's not really understood. So the whole interest in technology that young artists have can be traced back right to Andy Warhol. And of course, their interest in pop culture, which is overwhelming for young artists, really has its roots in Andy Warhol and, of course, the whole pop art movement.
Coming up, much more about the Marilyn Monroe portraits from our 4 guests. And then we'll bring in Lego designers Kitt Kossmann and Christopher Stamp. They'll share what went into the work of recreating the Marilyn Monroe portraits in Lego art. And it wasn't as simple as you might think.
When we scaled the Marilyn Monroe picture, we had to get the size of her head right for our pixelations.
So it's very strange how just moving 1 pixel left or right can change the shape of the face drastically.
There's so much more to come. Stay with us. Andy Warhol really changed the concept of being an artist. How was he different? Blake Gopnik?
Well, because he really conflated being an artist with being a celebrity. And he made that conflation of the 2 categories his central artistic gesture, if you like. I mean, Salvador Dali was also a famous celebrity artist, and so was Frida Kahlo. But their art was kind of freestanding. They used their persona, you could say, to sell people on their art. Whereas it was kind of the other way with Andy Warhol. He produced the art to sell people on the persona. The art becomes a kind of stand-in for him. If you see a Marilyn, you're as likely to think, oh, that's that thing made by Andy Warhol, as to think, oh, Andy Warhol is that guy who makes Marilyn Monroe paintings.
How did he really get in with the celebrity crowd?
Already at the time that Andy was an illustrator, he already was starting to move into the worlds of higher New York culture because he was producing illustrations of luxury goods. And he was always interested in climbing into a higher level of society. He comes from the really poorest, most disadvantaged working class background. So he was always interested in mixing with high society, and celebrity was certainly part of that. You know, it takes him a while to really start mixing with celebrity proper. And that really happens in the 70s. When he starts doing portraits of celebrities, he obviously becomes part of their world as well. I personally believe that his interest in celebrities always came with a certain distance from them. That is, they were always something closer to art supplies for him or the subjects of his art than his real friends. I don't think his interest in celebrity was the kind that a fanboy would normally have. It was more sophisticated. It was more about an artist looking at the world.
Jessica Beck, what do you think made Warhol different as an artist?
I think the biggest thing with Warhol, the most unique thing about him, was that he wasn't afraid to take risks. And you see that strength in his work from the very beginning until the very end of his career. So if you think of Warhol growing up in Pittsburgh to this very working class upbringing, immigrant upbringing, he's, first generation born here in Pittsburgh, is able to go to Carnegie Tech, which is now Carnegie Mellon, the only child of his two other brothers that was sent to school. And his mother fosters this creative spirit in him, and he makes it to New York with very little money, and somehow in that first decade becomes a celebrated commercial artist. He starts working for Glamour magazine and makes a name for himself. He buys a townhouse. He makes enough money to travel around Europe and Asia, and his mother eventually moves with him in New York. So there was always this sense where he's just going after this vision or this dream, and he's not risk averse. He's open to experimentation. He's open to failing. So he experimented with book publishing throughout his career. Not all of those books were successes during his lifetime. He experimented with filmmaking and television and photography and obviously painting. But even moments of performance and even working with, the Velvet Underground at a seminal moment in their career. So I think the biggest thing is that Warhol just really was open to experimentation and risk. And the other honest quality here is that he just really loved to work.
It sounds like he was also really confident. You have to be confident to try all of those things, right?
I think that's one of the really peculiar parts of Warhol's story, is that there is this confidence for sure, and almost a fearlessness, especially with his sexuality in the 1950s, at a time when homosexuality was still considered, was policed in New York. So for Warhol to do early drawings of boys kissing or nude drawings of men in the 1950s is really kind of revolutionary. But I think the interesting thing about Warhol is he's confident, but also very vulnerable and quite shy at different moments in his life. And if you think of him physically, he was shot in 1968. He grew up quite frail with an illness at a young age. He wore toupees all of his life, and post-shooting he wore corsets because of a hernia after the surgery. So if you think of him kind of underneath his, if you want to call it, his Andy Warhol suit, there's a lot of vulnerability, I think, underneath all of that. But for sure, there's a sense of confidence, and maybe it's just his Leo nature.
There's a lot to unpack here. How he moves from Pittsburgh to New York with very little money and becomes a celebrated commercial artist and makes a name for himself working in advertising and for Glamour magazines. His mother moves in with him. How he puts on a persona in the Andy Warhol suit. His techniques and his willingness to take risks experimenting with many different media. We'll get into all that, but let's dive a bit deeper into the part about taking risks. Blake Gopnik, what can you add to that?
One of the greatest things about Andy Warhol as an artist is the risks he took from the very beginning. I mean, one day when he was in college yet, the students were all asked to do a self-portrait, and they all painted their self-portrait, as you'd imagine. And when Andy showed his to his classmates, they said, "Wait, who's that girl? Is that your sister?" And he said, "No, I've always wanted to know what I'd look like as a girl. So right there, he's already doing gender bending, even as a college student. And he went on to always take risks like that, whether it was risks around his own homosexuality, whether it was risks about what counts as art. I mean, those Campbell soup cans that we love so much today, those Marilyns that we like so much, were greeted when they first came out as absurdly impossible objects, as objects that couldn't possibly qualify even as art.
Looking at the work of our two younger artists, Devan Shimoyama and Lucia Hierro, it looks as if they're also taking risks in the way they work and the materials they use. Would you agree on that, Devan?
Yeah, I use a lot of materials that are sort of familiar to me, around me a lot. I think of Basquiat as having done similarly. And I think that there's something about the urgency to use what's around you or what's most familiar to you. It immediately imbues the work of art with a certain history and understanding of how those things exist in your day-to-day life, and then changes the way that you're interacting with the painting or receiving information in that way. So if I'm using a craft material, or if I'm using a giant brooch that my great-grandmother wore at church, I think that sort of holds a certain weight to it, and that is then automatically in the painting itself. So there's a real energy to ready-made materials.
What about you, Lucia? Are you also a risk taker?
I'd like to think so. The sewing and all of that could easily, and especially as a woman, could easily just be seen as a sort of craft woman's work and be devalued even further because of it. But I think that there's something to be said about using this material and the way that people relate to it.
Jessica and Blake, can you guys tell me something about Andy's revolutionary techniques?
Yeah, Warhol always worked in a type of practice that dealt with making multiples. So whether that be his early drawing technique that he created in the 1950s, called the blotted line technique, in which he could trace an image and then outline the image in Dr. Martin's dye, stamp it with a piece of paper, and have multiple versions of the same shoe. Screen printing techniques were considered commercial techniques at the time that he was using that practice on his paintings. He actually taught Robert Rauschenberg how to screen print and had Rauschenberg over to a studio to show him his brand new paintings in 1962. So there's always a sense with Warhol where he's almost working in what appears to be a mechanical way or somehow erasing the hand. But he's not doing that, really. He's putting a lot of work into the painting process and image making throughout his career.
I'm not sure that Andy Warhol was interested in the painting process the way traditional artists were, that is, taking up a brush and making marks with his hand. I think he was actually wildly against that. But he was very, very interested in the process of finding new ways of applying paint to surfaces. And his, of course, great innovation was to use the silkscreen, which had been used either for kind of very high printmaking or the lowest of low commercial art, and using that to make this particularly new kind of thing called pop art. And everyone has always imagined that because he used silk screening, which can be used for industrial processes, that somehow he was engaged in mass production, but that wasn't true. Almost every silk screen he made, every pop silk screen he made at least, he probably held the screen down himself. He did a lot of what they call the squeegeeing himself. He was deeply involved with maybe one or two assistants, but there was never an assembly line. But he loved to pretend there was an assembly line. And that's his really great innovation, was to dare to pretend that his art was made by a machine, to pretend even that it looked like it was made by a machine, to talk about it in those terms, even though if you look at the Marilyn Monroe painting or an Elvis Presley painting, and we call them paintings even though they're silk-screened, they're very messy. They're not at all slick and machine-like. So you can tell immediately that they're handmade because they're in a sense so badly made. But somehow or other, the very fact of using a silkscreen spoke to people about mass production.
But the other thing I should just mention is technology was always something that Warhol was interested in, whether that be with his filmmaking practice in the 1960s, or the television episodes that he created in the 80s, or the cameras that he started purchasing, the automatic cameras that he was using in the late 70s and early 80s. So it was always an interest in a small, compact automatic camera that he could take anywhere and always with him. So,
Yeah, just like a phone.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of that, if he was alive today, how do you think he would embrace modern technology and social media?
Oh, whoa.
Let's go around the table with this and start with you, Lucia. What do you think?
I think he would have the most followers ever. I think he would crash Instagram. I think there would just, I think he, and oddly, I think he would want to break that apart. I think that should Andy have existed, there would be no number count of media followers. I think he would have obliterated that and totally sort of democratized it in that sense. There would be no blue checks.
The problem with talking about Andy Warhol liking anything we know about today is that he always wanted to be ahead of the curve. So if I've heard of Instagram, Andy Warhol wouldn't have been interested anymore. Once Blake Gopnik has heard of something, it's too late in the game to get involved. I think he might have been interested in something like virtual reality. What else might he have been interested in? He would have been interested in the latest cutting edge technology always, but only to corrupt it. He wouldn't have been a normal Instagrammer. After all, you could say that he had invented Instagram already with his use of everyday snapshots in the 1970s and 80s. So he was done with that. If he were still alive today, he'd be doing something so exciting that you and I can't even imagine what it would be. I mean, that's the amazing thing about Andy Warhol. Until July of 1962, if you'd asked someone, could Campbell's soup cans be painted as art, they would have said, no, absolutely not. You can't imagine what Andy would do next, and that's what makes him such a great artist.
You're so right. If we've heard of it, then it's passé.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was certainly his view. He hated anything that he called corny. And I think a good definition of the corny is something that's been done so much it no longer has any real cultural interest.
I think about that sometimes, actually, and I thought about it most recently when I was looking through another photographer. Their Instagram presence a couple years ago was really kind of pushing the boundaries of what Instagram was for and our expectations of that. And I thought, they were doing these really warped self-portraits on their social media. And I was like, this is kind of strange and unusual to see this prominent photographer doing this thing on social media and just kind of playing and not giving any explanation as to what they're doing and allowing people to sort of receive it as they will. And this is Cindy Sherman I'm talking about, by the way, just to like put the name out there. But, I found it fascinating to see someone just doing something against the grain of what everybody else was doing. And I could see Warhol having maybe done that at the beginnings of Instagram. I feel like maybe now he'd already be like past TikTok and all whatever else is coming out. So I kind of agree with that. Like, I feel like at this point, he wouldn't be really doing anything on Instagram. I think he'd be in some other, maybe VR, other technologies that are upcoming. Yeah.
Yeah. And if he was using Instagram, like you said, it would be in a way that was the opposite of how the everyday person would use it.
Yeah.
And I think he would make full use of everything available, VR, all of it. Because that's just sort of was his nature, was to go to the fringes, and he would have made all sorts of movies too by now.
Yeah. The thing about social media and technology right now that's actually very fascinating is that you have this close proximity, or what feels like close proximity, to celebrities and politicians and brand influencers. Or, the average person can look at photos of Kim Kardashian in her kitchen on social media. So Warhol was always fascinated by that idea of proximity to wealth and celebrity and fame, and this kind of concept of fame, and also this concept of self-fashioning or publicizing, creating publicity about yourself, having your photo taken. Warhol loved having his photo taken. So he lived in a way, especially that final decade when the technology of cameras had become small and, James Bond-like, you could put in your pocket and take several rolls of film very quickly. Warhol loved that, and he did take multiple rolls of film on a daily practice. Warhol definitely would have had a social media presence.
I wonder if he would be following anybody or if he would be one of those users that doesn't follow anyone. I think it would be more like that. Or it would be something very obscure.
Yes. He would be friends with some of the cast of RuPaul's Drag Race, and that's about it. Like, there wouldn't be anybody else.
Yeah.
He would never follow a celebrity back, ever.
Yeah, you're so right. Money was tight when Andy Warhol came to New York in 1949 with only $200 in his pocket. Jessica Beck, what can you tell us about this time?
Yeah. So Warhol graduated from Carnegie Tech, which is now Carnegie Mellon, and he went to New York with a classmate and friend, Philip Pearlstein, who's actually still alive and painting. Became a famous figurative painter, most notably in the 1970s. And they shared a small room in an apartment. And Warhol, he and Philip Pearlstein used a Rolodex from a professor from Carnegie Mellon to get interviews at ad agencies to start making money. And Warhol ended up being very successful very quickly. And again, I think that's because he had this habit of making lots and lots and lots of options for the editors. So there are early photographs. You can see him in his bedroom doing these early drawings, these 50s drawings, these advertisement drawings, and there's paper everywhere. And at the Andy Warhol Museum, we have hundreds and hundreds of these drawings and left over from that period. So I think the thing with Warhol at that moment in the 1950s is he was very hungry for notoriety and success, because while he was getting paid and doing these advertisement drawings, this advertisement work, he was also doing things like making handmade artist books and sending them to Diana Vreeland, the head of Vogue, and Truman Capote, kind of courting Truman Capote at a young age. So there was this sensibility of him wanting to expand his social network and build a network that would get him into the art world, into the blue chip art world.
Blake Gopnik, what can you tell us about where he lived when he came to New York?
When he started off in New York, for a month or two, he lived in a cockroach-infested, kind of classic little artist tenement apartment down in what we call Alphabet City. Then he had the second place he lived was also a sublet, but it was one end of the loft that belonged to a radically avant-garde dancer called Francisca Boas. And her piano player was actually the great, great modern composer John Cage. So in that loft, Warhol, I think, was exposed for the first time to really radical avant-garde art. And that matters a whole lot to what came after. He started off awfully poor, but it wasn't long before he started pulling in the contracts. Within weeks, really, of arriving in New York, he was getting awfully good contracts for commercial work. And before long, he was getting rich enough to get his apartment to move up in the world, get better and better apartments, and eventually pay for it to be decorated in the latest camp style. He bought himself, sterling silver cutlery. He really moved up in the world. And then in 1960, kind of just the moment before he stops making pop art, he's already rich enough to buy this fancy townhouse on the Upper East Side.
And in this fancy Victorian townhouse, he started out making his art in his living room. He outgrew that very quickly and got an old, abandoned, very leaky firehouse instead. But then in early 64, he found a big old factory space. What can you tell us about that?
Some people have said it was a hat factory. Other people have said it was a shoe factory. There's no evidence for either. But it was a big scruffy factory, and he turned that into what he called the capital F factory. And that was the name of his studio. And he got one of his helpers, one of his followers, one of his acolytes named Billy Name to cover every surface with either silver foil, with aluminum foil, or with silver paint. And it became the Silver Factory, the space that reflected everything that was going on inside it.
Oh, wow. I went to a weird party one time and everything was covered in tinfoil. And I wonder if that was sort of an homage.
Yeah, you end up seeing tinfoil all over. There's a bar in New York City called The Factory, actually, that's completely covered in silver in their back room. And it's specifically meant to evoke Warhol's most famous studio and hangout space. People would come in and enjoy themselves, have parties in Andy Warhol's Silver Factory.
Well, then we all have what we need to be Warhol wannabes in our kitchen drawer.
In the kitchen drawer. He eventually got it supplied for free by by Alcoa, the big aluminum maker, because he started out using the cheapest tinfoil on the planet, and they decided that they could supply him with something better.
When you get successful, you get the good aluminum foil.
And he got free Campbell's soup, too. He can't have laughed at that.
I know that you were saying that, he would throw out so many projects because he would want to just see which ones stuck and which ones could bring in some extra money. But how would you describe him as a businessman?
I think, the interesting thing about Warhol is there's this sense to look at his career that, he took the bus to New York and became famous as soon as he hit the sidewalk. But that's not true at all. It really took a full decade. It was a whole 10 years before anyone was really paying attention to Andy Warhol. And he had a lot of rejection. So I think that goes back to this idea of Warhol not being afraid of risk. We have several of the early rejection letters in the archives of the Andy Warhol Museum. From different projects that he was trying to do, whether that be with the advertisement work or shows that he was trying to be a part of. He was famously rejected from the Tanninger Gallery for his early boy book drawings, for instance. So in that first decade, he makes a ton of money in advertising work, so much so that he's able to buy a townhouse and move his mother, Julia Warhol, from Pittsburgh to come and live with him in New York. And when he gets to 1962, he's doing these hand-painted paintings, and he's doing his now iconic Marilyn Monroe and Jacqueline Kennedy paintings, but he's still doing advertisement work. So he's finally getting the gallery exhibitions that he wants in California at the Ferris Gallery for his Silver Elvis paintings, in New York with the Stable Gallery, and then eventually with Leo Castelli. But in that 60s period, he didn't completely abandon the advertisement work. It's still there because it's still making him money. And that's kind of an interesting part of Warhol's story, is that while he's navigating this blue chip gallery world, even throughout later parts of his career, he's still doing advertisement work.
Well, it's funny, there's a story that Andy Warhol was a sellout and a cheapskate, and I guess to a very limited extent he was, but people often imagine that by becoming a pop artist, a famous pop artist, he became rich, or that he only became a pop artist to become rich, and that's kind of absurd. In 1960, if you told someone you were going to become a fine artist in order to get rich, they would have laughed at you, right? That was a way to lose money quickly, not to make money. And that's what happened even to Andy. He was doing really well as an illustrator, and he took a pretty big hit to his income when he decided to be a fine artist instead. Throughout the 60s, he never makes a whole lot of money selling his art. He starts making bits and pieces of money through some of his avant-garde films, to his own surprise as much as anyone's. But then in the 70s, he starts making money through his society portraits.
He does hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of portrait commissions, and that money feeds other creative projects for him. Warhol TV, Interview Magazine. So there's always a sense with Warhol that he's doing the gallery work, he's doing the blue chip world work, and he's also always has somewhat of a side hustle, you could call it, of advertising work or commercial commissions. He even becomes part of a modeling agency in the 80s. So there's always a sense with Warhol that he was very money conscious, and I think that comes from not growing up with money, and so always wanting to have that security blanket, a financial security blanket.
Yeah, how important do you think money was to him?
Oh yeah, I think it was many things. I think money with Warhol was a fascination. He loved being around wealthy people. He was sort of fascinated by wealth and old money. John Gould is this late boyfriend. John came from an old money New England family, and Warhol was kind of fascinated by that sort of upbringing. And the people around him, Bridget Berlin, came from a very, very wealthy upbringing. So Warhol was fascinated by people with money, or people that grew up with money. But, by 1979 up until 1987, Warhol has this Interview magazine that becomes a real business, and he has people on the payroll. So you can hear later in his career, other people that worked with him, like someone like Vincent Fremont, talking about Warhol feeling responsible financially for these people. It's almost, he essentially had a business at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, it depends who you ask. Some people think that Andy Warhol was a terrible skinflint, but lots of people say he was also absurdly generous. At least on occasion, he would pay for his assistant, Gerard Malanga, to take a cab all the way up to a far point in the Bronx. That must have been, a very expensive cab ride. I think there's like with many of us, there's an exquisite mixture. There's certainly records of him being cheap. And he did like to have money. He grew up unbelievably poor. And there's no doubt that one of his goals in life was to make money. But I would say that took second place to his central goal in life, which was to be the most exciting, important, most avant-garde artist anyone could imagine. That's what he really cared about. But he also wanted to make money at the same time. And there aren't a lot of artists who achieve the two things.
What would you say was the piece that really got the ball rolling for him, that really led him to just explode into the scene?
I guess the first time that Andy Warhol got really big exposure was actually, funnily enough, not in New York, the center of the American art world, but in Los Angeles in July of 1962, when he shows all 32 of his first Campbell soups. That gets him coverage in Los Angeles especially, but in all sorts of art magazines. It seems so ridiculous that people give it big coverage. And then the Marilyn painting gets him coverage. He becomes famous amazingly quickly. Doesn't mean he became rich amazingly quickly because of his fame, but he becomes famous for being the wackiest artist in America and famous for being one of the strangest characters in the art world. And he played with that. He liked that rather than hiding from it the way a lot of artists might have done.
So being this wacky character, as Blake puts it, was a big deal to Warhol. The whole thing about becoming this persona and putting on the Andy suit is what we're going to hear more about in the next part of this Lego art soundtrack. After that, we're also going to be speaking with our guests about the Marilyn portraits.
One of Andy's greatest gifts and feats is sort of that immediacy and repetition.
It still stands as a kind of celebrity portrait.
So I don't know, it really changes the way I look at everything looking back at that.
The work still remains so contemporary when you look at it.
They're pretty brilliant.
And also bring in the two Lego designers who created the mosaics that you might be working on creating in Lego bricks right now, and hear their thoughts on Warhol.
I think this pop art had always fascinated me. It's very timeless and very modern still.
And what it's like recreating the portraits in Lego art.
This was a very different type of Lego puzzle.
There's so much more to come. Stay with us. Let's talk a bit about sculpting his persona. Jessica Beck, why do you think it was so important for him to be that character?
Well, Warhol grew up, when he was quite young, he had this illness called St. Vitus's dance. And he, because of that and other issues that he had, this really blotchy skin. So he was often made fun of for his blotchy skin and his red nose. So he was very sensitive about his appearance. And so when he gets enough money in New York, he starts buying toupees. Eventually, later in his life, he buys very fancy toupees from, I think, Italy. We have wigs, they were special made. And in that 60s moment, that silver wig is the fright wig, is a very dramatic kind of appearance that he creates. But each decade with Warhol, there's a different look that he solidifies. So in the 60s, it's the striped boat neck shirts with the black jeans and the leather jackets. And then eventually in the late 70s, early 80s, he's wearing cowboy boots and jeans all the time. And there's this early interest in a perfect image or wanting to have a beautiful face or, look like celebrities in the magazines. So I think that's why, Warhol was able to harness those fantasies so well in his art practices, because he shared those same desires that we all have, where we sort of compare ourselves to advertising images or celebrity images.
Do you think that worked? Do you think it made him more famous?
I think that for sure his Andy suit, you could call it, with the wig and the different fashion statements that he made, that he consistently wore the same thing for different periods, very much became part of his brand. And again, I think that Warhol understood the concept of branding very well, and consistency, and he loved having his photo taken. You can see photos by Edward Wallowich in the 1950s, Dwayne Michaels, another famous photographer, Otto Fenn, all of these photographers, Warhol just loved having his photo taken. So in the 1960s, he has people around all the time taking photos of him. And then later he's happy to be recorded on the TV episodes. So he had this real fascination with, the mediated image, or seeing yourself in photographs or on TV. And so I think that worked, the branding.
The look that he had in the 60s also became known as Cool Andy. And even though this was pretty early in his career as an artist, he was already a celebrity himself. There was an incident that you describe in your Warhol biography, Blake, where he was surrounded by fans at an opening of a show in Pennsylvania. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, in the fall of 1965, the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia decided to have what they called a survey show of Andy Warhol's art, but he'd only been making art for 3 years, so it wasn't much of a retrospective. So they were going to have this show, and he was already pretty famous by then, but he didn't even realize how famous he was. This is the moment of Beatlemania, and what he realized is that he had created Andy Mania. He showed up for the opening. Already the previous night, the private opening of his show had been so crowded that works of art got damaged by people banging into them. So for the actual opening of the show, they had taken down all the art. So you could say that the only artwork on view was Andy Warhol himself. And he showed up in what became his classic outfit, sunglasses, leather jacket. He even had safety pins in the collar of his shirt, the way a punk might have done 15 years later. And he showed up and was absolutely mobbed by his fans, to the point where he had to flee up this staircase in the middle of the room and kind of take refuge at the top of it from these fans who insisted on having, their subway ticket signed and the can of Campbell's soup that they brought with them signed by Andy Warhol. And he was actually a little bit afraid of the commotion that his celebrity caused.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting, because nowadays, if you're an instant success because you look at how many people are, following you online. But then you wouldn't have really been able to gauge until, like you said, it comes to your public event.
Yeah, all of the great celebrities of the earlier part of the 20th century, Charlie Chaplin, even the Beatles, were shocked at how popular they were. They would show up and all of a sudden there'd be a million girls screaming at them and they'd say, "What is going on?" Well, I think Andy was even more shocked, because when you're a movie star or a rock star, you kind of expect that might happen. I mean, it had happened to Elvis. But when you're a high-end fine artist making what's actually extremely sophisticated conceptual art, to discover that there are a bunch of teenagers, screaming your name does come as a surprise.
Yeah. Do you think he liked that, or do you think it scared him?
I think he liked Andy Mania as yet another one of his art supplies, or even one of his works of art. He just loved the idea that he had caused this to happen in society. And an artist called Joseph Beuys in the 1980s came up with this notion of social sculpture, that one of the things an artist could do would be to intervene directly in the world around them. Well, I think Andy got to that notion before. He liked the idea that Andy Mania was his intervention into the normal life of his culture and his society. Not just something that lives in museums, but something that lives in popular culture.
Is that the moment he really stepped into his persona and became Warhol?
It's funny. Everyone imagines that the person making Andy Warhol's most famous pop art, the Marilyns, the Campbell Soups, was the Andy Warhol we know and love. That is the guy in the leather jacket with the weird affectless stare and the sunglasses. But actually, that doesn't come along. Andy doesn't invent that living sculpture really until his show in Philadelphia in the fall of 65. That's really when he takes on that look in a kind of full-bore mode. And then, of course, it sort of survives for forever afterwards, because that's the Andy Warhol we think we know. So he really has to adopt that persona, that costume. He said much later in life that he got tired of wearing his Andy suit. And it's really true that at a certain point, it just became a costume that he was clothed in at all times.
It almost makes me think of Karl Lagerfeld.
The funny thing is there's so many people that Andy knew who seem to have picked up where he left off. Karl Lagerfeld, I'm not sure Karl Lagerfeld would have been such a character, would have turned himself into such a character without the influence of Andy Warhol, who he actually met very early on in his career. Lou Reed, the great musician whose band, the Velvet Underground, was actually produced by Andy Warhol, said that he was watching Andy Warhol turn himself into a character. He said he was watching him like a hawk. And of course, Lou Reed becomes a famous character in rock and roll as well. I think Lou Reed, the character, and Lou Reed, the person, are closer to each other than Andy Warhol, the celebrity artist, was to the real Andy Warhol. When Andy Warhol got home at night, his old mother was there to greet him. Many mornings, they'd say a prayer together before he left his nice, tidy little home and went off to the factory to live a wild life, or to pretend to live a wild life at least. So Andy Warhol, the artist, and Andy Warhol, the good son at home, were very different characters.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the difference between public Andy and private Andy. I heard that he would ignore old friends in public at events and then call them to chit-chat when he came home. Is that right?
Yeah, Andy Warhol's old friends from the 50s, people like the art critic David Bourdon, knew Andy before he became kind of mute. So when they saw him in the 1960s, they couldn't quite understand why he would barely talk, why he seemed to be snubbing them, why he would put on this kind of this anomie, he'd be removed from the world. And then as soon as he got home, he'd call them and he was back to his old gossipy character. He had to inhabit that persona as Andy Warhol, the silent fool in a way in public. But when he was in private, even with old friends, he could take off that mask that he'd worn when he met them, just earlier that evening, and become the Andy that they'd known. Everyone who knew him really well said there were these two Andys, the Andy for public consumption, and then the gossipy, verbal, quite literate, almost intellectual Andy that he could be with really close friends. I mean, he was really good friends with a famous Shakespeare scholar. And that scholar said that they actually discussed Shakespeare. They'd go to plays together, and Andy was as good at talking about Shakespeare as anyone else he knew.
Wow. And then also really good at gossiping.
And he was a ferocious gossip. I've listened to some tapes of him gossiping, and it's a little much. But of course, the thing is, he can go from gossip to sophisticated talk about art, at the drop of a hat. And often with Andy, they're the same thing, because the gossip sort of becomes an art supply. His place in the world of celebrity, his place in popular culture, the things he was gossiping about become so much part of his art that it's hard to tell them apart.
It's so fascinating. He's such a true trendsetter, It's like he probably sometimes knew he was doing it, and sometimes he didn't even know he was doing it. And I think that's what makes him so intriguing. Yeah,
although for me, what really matters is that I think pretty much whatever he was doing, he did it because he wanted to make great art. And he just realized, as early as 1962, that the definitions of art had to change and were changing. And you couldn't just take a brush and start making marks on a canvas anymore. You had to really open up your mind to all sorts of things that no one else had thought about. So he's really one of the first conceptual artists of the 1960s, and that becomes a major art movement. And he's there earlier than just about anyone, to realizing that you don't necessarily have to make objects, that just your ideas, the ideas behind objects, or the ideas that don't even have objects associated with them at all, can be really great art.
It's so interesting that you would say he would be very gossipy and had a lot to say about just about everything. I've seen him being interviewed in some old clips, and I gotta say that I'm glad I wasn't the one interviewing him, because he gives these really short answers. There's even one interview out there where he doesn't say a word. He just brought someone along to answer questions for him.
It's funny, in Andy Warhol's very first published statement, he sounds perfectly normal. In fact, he sounds like one of those artists who's trying to show off how serious they are. He gives a nice little paragraph about, the way his art reflects the decadence of American consumerism. But pretty soon after that, he realizes, there's no future in that. He's not that good a talker anyways. So he becomes a kind of mute and he plays the idiot. So usually if you asked him a question, he would say things like, he'd just say yes or no matter how complicated the question was. Ask him, does your Mona Lisa represent the bankruptcy of all of fine art? And he would just say something like, no, or I don't know. But even more maddeningly, he just asked the reporter themselves to provide the answers to their questions. He'd say, I don't know anything. Can you just answer your own question? Which, of course, was maddening. It was part of something that went on in the 1960s. After all, the Beatles did it like crazy. When someone asks George Harrison, what would you call that hairstyle you're wearing? And George deadpanned an answer. He just said, Arthur. So, that kind of playing with interviewers was pretty typical. Warhol may have actually helped get it started because he was one of the first people to torture reporters in just that way. But he almost never answered a question seriously. But of course, the great thing about that is that it let his art speak for itself. If the guy who's supposed to be speaking for the art is that wordless or that dumb, then you have no choice but to go to the art itself. And I think that was his real goal, was to say, don't ask me, ask my art. And that was actually on the cutting edge of thinking at that moment. There was this notion of the intentional fallacy, that it was a fallacy to imagine that the artist's ideas or even the artist's biography mattered at all to understanding the art. So Warhol was keen to make it clear that you didn't come to him for answers, you went to the art itself.
Do you ever think he got tired of becoming a character that he wasn't, fully?
I think it was exhausting at a certain point. And what worries me more about Andy is that late in life, I think he himself started having a hard time distinguishing between the real Andy and the character. And I think it becomes kind of poignant late in life that he seems a little bit lost in a way he wasn't quite at the beginning. But I think that happens to everyone who becomes famous. I think fame is a dangerous commodity. And I think Andy was touched by it in a particularly strong way. It's like taking small doses of poison. You might not die in the end, but it might not be very good for your health.
Jessica, I know that you have something at the Warhol Museum that would indicate the whole dressing up and wearing wigs also has something to do with vanity?
Yeah. We have in the archives at the Andy Warhol Museum his passport photos from the 1950s, and he takes his passport photo and pencils in his balding hairline and chisels out a thinner nose.
I think we all wish we could do that to our passport photo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about how some of this was recreated in Lego art and bring in Lego art senior designer Kitt Kossmann and design lead Christopher Stamp. It's two-dimensional, which I imagine is different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How did that affect the process of creating it?
When we created this, it's I've been painting paintings before, and I really had to use that knowledge that I gained doing paintings when I did these ones. Because it is flat images and you're working with colors. And the thing about mosaics is that you have to step away from them to actually really see what they are. When you're too close up to them, it sometimes just look like a ocean of colors. So I think the magic about them is that when you move a bit away from them, you can suddenly see what it is. And that is a bit like painting. So I really used my painting skills when I did these mosaics. But it's a very different experience compared to what I've been doing so far. But I knew it from back then. So in that respect, it was nice doing something different and getting back to that media again.
I think when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, this will be, pretty simple. It's very lines of studs, very 2D, like you mentioned. Because I was a little bit naive as to the complexities it takes to create art. I think that's the biggest difference between Lego art and other Lego products, is that it's more art than design. You need to look at it the way you would look at a painting in a gallery rather than necessarily the way you would look at a sculpture. That's pretty strange just to when you step into it, when you're trying to design it from a mindset standpoint. I was very lucky because Kitt was on the team, and Kitt's got experience with art and painting previously. I think that the challenge that I noticed was you kind of, with most Lego products, you think about the play experience, but then that goes hand in hand with the building experience. And the two is kind of 50-50. You need to have fun when you're building it, and then you need to have fun when you're playing with it. But with this, the building experience to some extent takes a lesser seat. And because you're focusing more on the adults and it's a display piece rather than a toy, the visual aspect and that final visual display piece, that takes a very much greater role. So you don't need to necessarily build in hidden functions and features. The build of it's going to be placing a lot of 1x1 round plates in a row. That kind of takes care of itself. We found that to make that interesting, that was how we used the colors. So, for example, you'll see on some of them that we don't have just a plain background. We tried to mix, maybe include dark blue and black in a pattern to make that build a bit interesting, so you don't feel it's repetitive, just placing the same color constantly. But it was more the use of how we use the colors together to give it that 3D look. So even though you're building something that's very 2D and flat, when you look at the individual images, when you look at that, then it's very 3D effect. That's the change, I think. That was the struggle I found, because when you build a normal Lego model, it's automatically 3D.
In the box, in the Lego art set, it comes with a booklet, and it says, "Relax and reconnect with your creative side." Can you tell us more about that idea, and why do you think it's so appealing to people right now?
I think it's very appealing to people because, like, we need some time for ourselves. It can be hard to find that space in a busy day. So I think this is one of the things that this product really do. It can actually give you some time to just dive into some arts and crafts. So it's almost like mindfulness, and I can also see like we've been like having different people doing this for us, and they like in a way really get into Zen, if you understand what I mean. It's like that's just where you are, because you have to you're occupied building, so and you also occupied listening to a podcast, so your mind doesn't really drift off, you're just plain there. So I think that's really what I think is really nice about this product.
I agree with Kitt. I think we discussed a lot about it. We went backwards and forth a lot about what is the purpose of this product? Who is this product targeted at? We never want to do a product just to say we've done it. That's not kind of the Lego approach. But we looked a lot more at, right now everybody is they're so busy, they're so rushed, there's always something to do, whether it's work or taking care of the kids or preparing food or all of this stuff. And we kind of just wanted to celebrate me time, where someone can take 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there and just grab a cup of coffee and sit down and build and really just put the headphones in and celebrate a bit of me time, a bit of relaxed time.
Now let's talk about Warhol. Who came up with the idea to recreate, the iconic Marilyn Monroe portrait in Lego bricks? How did you choose that one? Well,
because of the medium and the product line that we were creating being Lego art, we knew that one of our products had to be art focused. And we discussed the medium. We discussed a lot of the fact that we're building with 1x1 pieces and making some kind of mosaic format. And we explored different artists, but there's certain artists that you would need a million colors, maybe more than what the Lego color palette offers. And then there's other artists that's a bit more timeless. And when we were thinking about these different artists, Andy Warhol's name just kept coming back up repeatedly. He just seemed to fit the medium that we were creating. And then obviously choosing Marilyn, for us from a standpoint, therefore you're really becoming a bit more interesting and appealing to several audiences, because maybe you're a big Marilyn Monroe fan and not so much Andy Warhol, or maybe you're a huge Andy Warhol fan and not so much Marilyn. Well, with this product, therefore, you can kind of capture the interest of twice as many people. And if you are a Marilyn fan, you can learn a little bit more about Andy Warhol, and if you're an Andy Warhol fan, you can learn a little bit more about Marilyn. So it's also to educate as well a little bit.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think also that is one of the most popular like images that he've done, and most well-known images that he've done. So I think it was also quite like a good idea to take that one, because like the soup can or the banana wasn't really an option. So, and this Marilyn Monroe image comes in different colors, so it just also suited the concept really well.
Absolutely, especially what you might find, especially because retro is coming back a little bit, or has been back a little while now. Some people might know this image, younger generations might know this image, but not actually know the artist or the lady in the picture. So it's also going to be quite appealing to those people, just because it is quite a famous image in itself.
Yeah, and like you said, these paintings are so iconic and recognizable. So was there a lot of pressure to get it just right?
It was definitely a challenge to get it right, because when we scaled the Marilyn Monroe picture, we had to get the size of her head right for our pixelations, to get all the details in her face right. And that took quite some tryouts before we got it all right, because we needed to get the details right. And of course, like everybody knows how that image looks, so you would recognize quickly if it didn't look like her, because you know exactly how it looks.
Yeah, it's definitely I don't think before this project that we'd never stared at people's faces in such a in-depth way, to be honest. And it was very strange, because it kind of goes back to that different mindset between an artist and a designer, because you're looking at Marilyn's face or some of the other faces, and you're looking at it and you're thinking, there's something just about the chin that's not quite right. So you would maybe need to move the whole picture slightly one way so that it lined up better with the pixelation that we have. Or you might need to, maybe the eyes aren't quite working, so we need to readjust the scaling to get the eyes right. And then as soon as you do that, it has a knock-on effect on the chin or the hair or something else. So it's very strange how just moving one pixel left or right can change the shape of the face drastically.
Yeah, and especially I think what I found doing portraits is also that the chin line, it can change everything. And it can, like, sometimes you actually have to make the image like slightly bigger or slightly smaller just to get the chin line right, because sometimes the chin line ends between 2 pixels, and then the head gets like slimmer or bigger than it actually is. So that can be quite a challenge. And also she has these like sleepy, sexy eyes on the picture, and also to get that part right, and to get there's like the eyeshadow and the lipstick on her to make that look like the original Andy Warhol. That also was a bit of a challenge. So this image is actually, we're a bit closer on her face than the original image, but I think it turned out quite good.
Take us through a bit of the process. You want to do a certain image. Mm-hmm. What's the next step? How do you begin?
Oh, when you have to do an image, first of all, you have to find out how this image is going to work with the amount of pixels that you have available. And the images we've been working with so far is 48 times 48 pixels. So what we do is that, like, we crop the picture in different ways, and then in Illustrator there's a function called mosaics, and by doing that you can start to see where the image would turn out the best, how close you actually need to go to the image. And when you've done that, then that image actually has, because it's taken from the original photo, it has a lot of colors in it. So now we have to bring it down to the Lego colors, so fewer colors, and that is done manually. So that's how you do it. And then when you've done that and have like sit there with the Lego colors, you can start seeing if you're onto something. And then Chris and I have developed a skill doing this process where we kind of paint on top of it to find the lines, because what happens when you do these mosaics that sometimes you just lose track of the eyes and the nose and the mouth. You really need to have those lines to put on top of your image to kind of capture that again. And then you start doing some serious cleaning.
Oh, wow.
And when you've done that, then you talk to your colleagues and you discuss, oh, is this it? And do. And then you like build it up. And then you look at it and you say, okay, is there some adjustments that we need to do to this, or are we there? So that's pretty much the process of making these portraits. But like the first piece of it, just finding the right cropping and turning it into Lego colors can be quite a hassle.
I think the best thing, just adding to what Kitt was saying, the lucky thing that we had on this project is the fact that we were a two-person team. And I think that was perfect, because after like Kitt mentioned, we would capture the lines, but after you've spent 4 hours, or 3 hours even, just staring really zoomed in on this, you look at it so long that you kind of convince yourself, okay, yeah, I've captured it, even though you might have moved away completely from the jawline. So it's great then, because we could do check-ins where I would look at Kitt's and Kitt would look at mine, and then we would be saying, you know what, there's something quite not right just about the nose. And you would look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, which was great, where you can then kind of look at the whole picture as a whole rather than just focusing on a specific detail.
So what was it like building it and looking at the finished product for the first time?
Oh, I felt very proud. It was like when you do them in Illustrator, which is the program we're working in, they like actually the images look really, really good. But when you build them, they just look much better. We normally said like, if they look good in Illustrator, they're going to look great when they're built. And because they start like, they had this special like shine to the actual like plates that we were using. And some of the mosaics that are built with bricks with studs on, like small round one plates with studs on. And that, like when you've built those, they just like look like cross stitches in the right light. They really got beautiful.
Yeah.
So I felt proud.
Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge, well, not the biggest challenge, the biggest difference with this product line, this is a mainly digital project. Given the size and the time it takes to build one of these, it normally takes you about 3-4 hours to build a full mosaic. We just found that it was more cost effective in terms of the time we had to just do it digitally. So we would look at different color variants and things digitally, because we simply, by the time you'd spend 4 hours building one, then just to realize, actually, I don't want that color. It doesn't really work. So we did a lot of the building very late after we'd kind of locked in what we wanted. There was one, actually, with Marilyn Monroe, we couldn't pick out the shade of blue that we wanted. So we knew that we wanted the certain colors for the main image, but when it comes to the alternatives, we couldn't figure out what that extra color we needed to add would be to create the differentiation. So that was the only point in the process where we actually physically built the different alternatives, because the color on the screen doesn't necessarily, like Kitt mentioned, line up with the physical color. So what we had to do is we had kind of a rack that looked like an old record collection, but instead of records, it was basically a pile of these different mosaics, the same image in different colors, where we then put them all up together and went through and said, what are the pros and cons for each one? Which one popped the best, to find the right shade to add?
Yeah, I remember like we did one in, I think it was light aqua in the face, and it just turned out to look like a face mask.
Yes,
but like it didn't look that great. So we ended up taking another color, leaving that one out.
Yeah, and especially for the main part of Marilyn's face, we when we do IP minifigures, so when we do like a minifigure in Star Wars or superheroes, there's a certain skin tone that we use. We don't use yellow minifigures for those. We tried that color on the faces, and it completely looked like she was wearing some kind of Venice mask kind of thing, some kind of face mask. And it's that kind of attention to detail where even the shade that we choose can have such a large impact.
Definitely. At one point, we also used the skin color for her face. And the thing is that in the bricks in that box has to be cross-used on the different images, just like depending on which image you want to build as a customer. So the face color looked okay for face color, but it just looked really weird when it started being like the hair color or the background color. So we decided to go for the light pink as her facial color. And I think that was really good. That was a good decision.
Yeah, and that's how we had to design them. We of course, we started with the main image, which is the hero image, if you will. But we had to design this all 4 parallel at the same time. We didn't design the first one and then after that try to figure out the others and see what worked. We really tried to figure out all 4 at the same time, just because that was the only way that you can do a product like this, where it is a 4-in-1 or a 3-in-1. You can't put something on the back burner and say, okay, I'm going to look into that one next week, but I'm going to take care of this one now. If you change the hair on one, you then need to go and change the hair on the others and then recount how many times am I using the yellow or how many times am I using the blue. Or this was a very different type of Lego puzzle.
Yeah, well, I imagine it sounds like it was almost counterintuitive when it comes to, like you said, the skin color. You try it out, and you realize, oh, no, that didn't work. Back to the drawing board. Can you take any of the tiles and, like, for instance, could you make Marilyn's smile bigger if you placed some in different locations? Or is it sort of we stick to the grid to get just the perfect image?
They can try it out. But yeah, maybe they can make her smile. I'm sure some can make her smile. And I think if they want to, they should do it.
Yeah.
That would look really awesome too.
With all of these products, because they are a 4-in-1 and you cannot possibly do these designs with the same number of each color, we have to include extra pieces. So compared to a normal Lego product, when you finish building one of these mosaics, you will also end up with a pile of Lego pieces left over. Those aren't by accident. Those are to allow you to build the others. So for example, with this piece, Monroe, you'll get 850 extra 1x1 pieces. And that's to allow you to build all 4. So that allows you that gives you the opportunity to maybe make the mouth bigger if you want to. That's not why it's there, but there is the possibility of doing it.
Take caution. Proceed at your own risk.
Yeah.
Now, why do you think Warhol and his art is still so relevant today and an inspiration to so many younger artists?
I think this pop art had always fascinated me. It's very timeless. I think that's what it is. It's very bright and popping and very modern. I think it's because it's timeless that it's kind of appealing still.
And do you think Andy would approve? What do you think he would say if he could see his paintings recreated in Lego art?
I think he would like it.
Yeah, I do too.
I really do.
Andy was all about creativity. I think I would hope that he would be pretty happy with it.
Let's talk more about the Marilyn Monroe paintings. First, I'd like to hear what they meant to you, Devan and Lucia, and maybe how they've influenced you as artists. Devan?
The Marilyn portraits, I always, when I was a kid, I'd seen them. I mean, it became just sort of merchandise. Maybe a good comparison would be to something like, I thought of it like Hello Kitty. It was almost just like a staple. It's this thing that has no real backstory. It's a potent image that has a punch. It's recognizable, but it almost becomes backdrop. And I think that's the power of that sort of, that familiarity with certain types of images of celebrity just becomes this sort of nothingness. But he's sort of pointing to that commodification of celebrity culture or, a multitude of layers to that. But then I start, when I get to about college, I think I saw, I forget which movie it was, but it was the first Marilyn Monroe movie that I had seen was in college in a class of mine. And, then now there's all this content buzzing beneath all of these images that I've seen in my entire childhood growing up. So I don't know, it really changes the way I look at everything looking back at that. But I think it makes me think about the significance of having an iconic image. And and the power of a multiple in printmaking. And I think that that's how the Marilyn portraits maybe impacted me most directly in thinking of like, how much you can sort of alter the perception of someone through mass producing images of them. And it sort of created this barrier around Marilyn that we don't really know her. We know her as this like singular static image, and it sort of really mimics the way in which we believe we understand or know a celebrity or someone of importance who has a massive presence like that, but we don't quite. So I think the iconic image is what I take from that, and I try to do that with a lot of my paintings. A lot of the time, I'm really interested in like symmetry. The figure must be centered, or I should sort of have a direct gaze with the viewer. So a lot of those things I think come loosely out of work like the Marilyn portraits. Not necessarily just those, but work like that.
Lucia, what do you think?
I love those. Those are so great. I think that one of Andy's greatest gifts and feats is sort of that immediacy and repetition. And he was so good at utilizing the medium of screen printing. And I think that coming from his like commercial background, he understood that taking one image and doing something to it over and over and over and over again until, there was nothing else to do to that thing, that you would find these different variations and that making something blue or red or yellow or would definitely change the read of the thing. And working for commercial publications, you learn that these variations definitely change the tone of something. And I think those Marilyn pieces are really brilliant because they got sloppy. Sometimes the lines, around the lips would get messy and it would look almost like this sort of reapplication of lipstick or makeup or felt that way, and they got messy. And for people who know a bit about Marilyn's life and personal life and that sort of thing, that image is haunting in that way. There was something that Andy sort of knew about that culture, about celebrity culture, that was darker and a little bit more grim than we realize. And so I think those pieces capture that, but they're amazing. They're pretty brilliant.
Totally. Warhol actually did Marilyn portraits both in 1962 and in 1967. In 62, he did a silkscreen painting that he named Marilyn Diptych. This one huge painting with the same Monroe face 50 times. 25 images on the left painted in color. The 25 on the right side are in black and white. This artwork was named the third most influential piece of modern art in a survey of 500 artists, critics, and others. And then there are the square artworks, where there is one portrait per frame. These are the ones that are used in the Lego Art Project. Warhol did 10 different versions in 10 different colors in 1967 and called this artwork Untitled from Marilyn Monroe. It's the same photo he used for both works, a promotional photo from the film Niagara from 1953. Jessica Beck, what can you say about the one from 62?
The Marilyn paintings, by that point, by 1962, Warhol's navigating the screen printing process. He's working in color, underpainting, and then screen printing over top of it. And then he's also working in a black and white screen printing process. So he's playing with diptych paintings, which would be two canvases next to each other that start to mirror things like the television screen or a film strip. So I think, that's part of it too with his painting practice. It often mirrors other media. So whether that be the portraits he made of Ethel Skull, for instance, that he made from photo booth strips from 42nd Street, that moves in a way. There's movement in those portraits. So in the early Marilyn paintings, he screen printed in a repetitive fashion that starts to look like a moving image, or multiples that look like a film strip or a television screen.
Blake Gopnik, what can you add?
Well, one of the things that's always said about the Marilyn Monroe paintings is that they were done right after Marilyn died. But, I dug into this and there's not really any decent evidence that that's the case. It is something that Warhol seems to have said about them. But the great thing about Andy Warhol is that he always said the thing that he thought would make for the best story. He didn't necessarily always tell the truth. And there's a little bit of evidence that Well, we certainly know he was fascinated by Marilyn Monroe for a couple of years before he made the painting of her. There was a photograph of her up on his wall years before he made the painting. She's an obvious subject for him. She didn't need to die to be a subject. And she hung out at a cafe called Serendipity Cafe, which still exists in New York, which was his main hangout. So it's very possible that they met even before he made the painting of her. But what matters most about that painting is that it's a silkscreen, that it's clearly made from kind of low-end studio photograph of Marilyn Monroe in one of her very first movies before she becomes the sex kitten, when she's playing a completely different role. Well, that's the photograph Andy chose to make into art. So this Marilyn Monroe is a kind of hinge for everything that Andy Warhol ever did. She represents so much in his life. And even though she may have been dead when he came to make it, it still stands as a kind of celebrity portrait, just like the celebrity portraits he did by the hundreds and hundreds in the 1970s. So it really is at the heart of his career. And the nice thing about the Marilyn is that he also did them in lots of different versions. And that's really important for understanding Andy Warhol, that he loved repeating the same image. And the question is, did he love repeating it to increase its power, right? If you keep yelling something, it gives it a kind of extra heft. Or on the other hand, it could be exactly the opposite, that when you repeat something often enough, like Campbell's soup cans on a supermarket shelf, they start losing their value. Well, the great thing about Andy Warhol is that it's always yes and no at the same time.
Is that part of the reason that the colors shifted from canvas to canvas?
You know, one of the interesting things about Andy Warhol, of course, is that he was very interested in using devices from popular culture, from commercial culture, and transferring those into high art. And of course, one of the things about textiles, and after all, paintings are painted on canvas, they are a kind of textile. Textiles are often made in different colors, right? You can get a tablecloth in red and green, or you can get the same pattern in blue and red. And so he took that notion that a single image can be done in lots of different colors, or what they call colorways, and transplanted that into fine art. And that's kind of exciting. I mean, in 1967, when he made this series of silkscreen prints, they came in all these different colorways, as though, in a sense, they were just commercial goods. Well, they weren't. They were high art. And what made them interesting is that they were high art pretending to be commercial goods. There's nothing interesting about a tablecloth you can get in different colors. That's normal. What's interesting is if you take that idea and turn it into high art like he did with his Marilyn prints.
We're almost at the end of this soundtrack with the story behind Andy Warhol and the Marilyn Monroe portraits. Thank you to the talented young artists Devan Shimoyama and Lucia Hierro. Also to Jessica Beck from the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, and Blake Gopnik, the author of the brand new biography simply entitled Warhol. Before we wrap it up, I have one more thing I'd like to ask Kitt and Christopher from the LEGO Group. It's normal that LEGO fans are creating something new, and now that these brand new LEGO art tiles are out there, do you expect that fans are going to start creating their own pieces? And if so, are you looking forward to seeing what they come up with?
Oh, I really hope that they'll do that. That could be very inspiring, also for us to see. I personally would like to do the Marilyn Monroe and like have 4 different versions and do it of my own family, so that we each become a different colored image. Instead of Marilyn Monroe, then just have the 4 of us. I have 2 daughters and a husband. So I hope others will do the same, definitely.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kitt. We've got such a fantastic adult community. And if you go on the internet, you can see they make these fantastic creations. Their imagination is just off the charts. I'm just excited to see what new things they come up with.
How is your piece of art coming along? Are you getting ready to hang it on the wall? Maybe you're ready to break it apart and build one of the other versions, or create your own. Thank you so much for listening. My name's Andrea Collins, and this has been an original soundtrack from LEGO Art.